Gonna bring out my American Idol. Yeah, no, I don't have those skills. So thank you very much to the organizers for having me here, and thank you to you for being here and staying despite the lack of coffee. So hopefully, I like the collective sigh. Hopefully we'll keep you awake with us. This is new work, joint with Chad Bown, who is here to keep me honest, and Rob Johnson, who is not. So, sorry, Rob. Today I'm going to talk about a topic I don't have to do a lot by the way of introduction in this room and particularly at this conference, but I will say it anyway. Global value chains are really important. If we take one measure of global value chains, production fragmentation, and we might consider a statistic like what is the fraction of final goods production that is comprised of imported or foreign sourced value added. In most, in fact, manufacturing sectors, is about 20% of final goods output consists of imported value added. But there are peaks and valleys across sectors, and some of the highest value-added sectors have more than 50% of output made up by imported value-added. Clearly, this is important. And here's a place where I think the policy community is, in large sense, in front of research, in front of many of us in this room. Policymakers have been talking about the importance of global supply chains or global value chains in shaping how governments conduct policy. And we can just look at some of the conversations out there. Right now, the WTO has a Made in the World initiative. This is all thinking about how products are made in the world, understanding that international commercial policy isn't about widgets that are made in one country and then shipped at the end of the process to another country. It's about how products are made in a globally integrated economy. A lot of the lobbying on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you can certainly argue that a lot of the contours of the agreement as we see it reflect global supply chain interests. What do firms want? What do firms need to make products efficiently all around the world? Interestingly, global supply chains are relatively new in formal economic research, particularly in empirical work. So in this paper, we're going to offer a first look at this very important question, asking two related questions. First, how do global supply chain linkages modify governments' incentives to impose protection? And then empirically, when we look at the data on trade policy as implemented in the world today and in the last 2 decades, can we see that global supply chain linkages are empirically important drivers of trade policy? So both what do global supply chains mean we should see in the data? Do we see that in the data? Maybe this works now. Maybe it's woken up. No. Oh. There is a power button.
Yeah, it was not on. Now it should be.
All right. Thank you. Perfect. Thanks. Okay. So here's our argument in a nutshell. First, let's be clear about what we're doing in this paper. We're going to focus on final goods tariffs, okay, trade policy as applied to final goods. And we're going to look for the shadow of global supply chains on that final goods trade policy. Intuitively, what do we expect to see? Well, we expect that supply chain linkages change the incentives for governments to manipulate final goods prices. So, an example. Think about a U.S. product, a U.S. imported product, maybe laptops, some final good, laptop computers. If there's a lot of U.S. upstream value added embodied in imported laptops, that means that when the U.S. increases tariffs on laptops, foreign final goods prices, foreign prices for laptops would go down. That's a standard terms of trade externality. But if there's a lot of U.S. value-added upstream components in that imported laptop, then the reduction in the foreign selling price is going to be felt by upstream U.S. producers. Some of the terms of trade externality on the final good of the tariff will be passed back up the value chain to U.S. constituents. They might lobby the government and say, hey, don't put tariffs on laptops because that reduces our profits. They don't need to lobby, right? Maybe the government just recognizes that it reduces U.S. national income to impose tariffs on final goods that embody a lot of U.S. value added that was initially shipped overseas. Okay, so higher U.S. value added and foreign final goods production should lower U.S. optimal tariffs. But there's another piece of this, which is if you think from the perspective of the host country that's using value added in local production, there's again an externality that enters through global value chains. So what does a tariff do? A tariff increases the local selling price of a good. So again, suppose we think about laptops being sold in the U.S. An increase in the U.S. tariff on laptops will increase the U.S. domestic price of laptops. That's costly for U.S. consumers. Through general equilibrium effects, it's also costly for other parts of the U.S. economy. But there are those who benefit from this, and those are U.S. laptop producers and all of the upstream industries that are supplying value-added components, supplying intermediate goods, supplying inputs to the final good production in the U.S. If a bunch of the U.S. domestic production of laptops is using foreign value-added, imported value-added, some of the benefit of that increase in U.S. tariffs is being passed over to foreign upstream producers. And again, all else equal, we would expect that that would mean the more foreign value added is embedded in U.S. domestic production, the lower should be U.S. domestic optimal tariffs. Okay, so this is the idea. Again, everything works through this key: supply chain linkages alter governments' incentives to manipulate final goods prices. We want to build a model to formalize these ideas. And so in this paper, what we're going to do is formalize these linkages and do it in a way designed explicitly so that we can go to data and ask the data, do final goods tariffs respond to global value chains the way that we think they should, given a fairly flexible theory? Okay, so the roadmap for the paper itself and the roadmap for my talk today. First thing we'll do is integrate supply chains into a terms of trade model of trade policy. This is a workhorse, completely standard model. This is the gold standard for empirical work on trade policy, and that's why we start here. You can see the appendix. There are lots of ways that you could develop this theory differently. The model will accommodate the ideas will accommodate many formal modeling structures. We're going to use the one that's most standard for approaching data. In our model, we'll show that final goods that are produced using domestic and foreign value added change the mapping from prices to income, and thus optimal policy, and we'll formalize what those linkages look like. We'll derive the optimal bilateral tariffs, and we'll do this in a model, again, designed to take to data. So we've got many countries, many goods, political economy, and crucially, we respect institutional constraints that are also going to affect how governments set trade policy in reality. So we're going to think very carefully about things like tariff reciprocity, potential reciprocity in preferential trade deals. We'll think about the structure of how tariffs can actually be set. We respect MFN. Okay. The theory yields these clean, very clean predictions that we then take to the data. And so then we do that. We'll estimate how import protection, again, on final goods, responds both to domestic content embodied in imported goods and final goods production, and how foreign content embodied in domestic goods also affects tariffs. Okay? When we go to the data, we will focus on bilateral applied tariffs. First, these are deviations from MFN trade policy. This is a really important point. We're going to look in an institutional setting where governments actually have discretion to change their trade policy in response to global supply chains. So we're going to look at deviations from MFN. Our data starts in 1995, so this is post-Uruguay. This makes a lot of sense to take MFN as given. We will then do a separate empirical exercise where we look not at bilateral preferential tariffs, which are showing up through regional trade deals, but actually more than anything else through generalized system of preferences or other, for want of a better phrase, funky trade deals that we see on the books. We'll also do this same exercise again, looking at the most discretionary of trade policy, which are temporary trade barriers, anti-dumping, CVDs, and the like. Okay. We're going to measure value-added content using now very familiar global I/O tables. We'll focus on WEO data. We don't need to. We could use GTAP. And we'll be very, very careful to address the MFN rule and reciprocity, not only in the theory, but also when we go to the data. All right. Are there any questions? You're very quiet.
The MFN you're going to take it is exogenous, so it's not affected from value chains. It's like the idea that when the Uruguay-Iran was negotiated, global value chains didn't matter?
Yes. Yeah, that's basically the idea, where they were very small. Crucially, in our implementation, this will be obvious in a few minutes, we're going to have fixed effects at the multilateral level that apply at the importer sector year level. And so those fixed effects, say we look within an importer sector year, that would swamp any MFN effects as well. Right? So we're really just going to look at the within variation. Now, there's another potential paper to be written. This is like Blanchard, Bound, and Johnson, paper 5, maybe. We've talked about this one, about how MFN tariffs may have evolved in an earlier time period in response to global supply chains, but that's not what we're doing here. Again, our idea, our concept for this first look at the imprint of global value chains on trade policy is to focus on measures of trade policy that have ample scope for discretion. Right? We want to see if governments are using the tools the way that we think global supply chains would tell them to do. Okay. So preview of results, and any other questions? Oh, good. Preview of results. Again, lacking coffee. Maybe I'll say these a few times before we leave the room today. Trust me, everything's correct. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was about to say, do I get to say nya nya? Sweet. This is, the benefit of being 14 steps down the hall is this is a repeated interaction. So thank you. Good. Preview of results. I feel better already. We're going to find that our data shows us ballpark what the model predicts. Now, this is not an enormous surprise, but this is helpful to know. Our model formalizes these very intuitive mechanisms. Our model disciplines the way we approach the data, and with the discipline of the model, we find that the data conform. Okay, and this is key. So, higher domestic value added, embodied in imported final goods, foreign final goods, leads to lower bilateral tariffs. This is consistent with a theory. Throughout everything I show you, we'll control for confounding factors using a very flexible fixed effects approach. Why are we doing a lot of fixed effects in this estimation? It'll be clear in a few minutes. There are lots of confounding factors like trade elasticities that we want to be able to sweep out to make sure they're not driving our results. The result holds only for non-reciprocal tariffs, crucially, and I'll show you this in a minute. That's exactly what theory would predict. So we're being serious about what reciprocity would mean, and when we go to the data, we find confirmation of our predictions. The result strengthens when we instrument. Many of you, in fact, many of the papers here, introductory comments have emphasized, what's the effect of trade policy on global value chains? Really important question. We're asking the reverse question, what's the effect of global value chains on trade policy? Yes, we should be worried about endogeneity. Yes, we are. We use instruments. Everything looks great, and in fact gets a bit stronger when we instrument. We also adjust for censoring by MFN. This gives us confidence and hopefully a little bit of credibility. We also find that higher foreign value added embodied in domestic final goods lowers bilateral tariffs. This is consistent with the theory, the intuition I laid out before, but there's actually another piece built in here, which is we don't think that what we call the FVA, the foreign value added effect, is going to show up if foreign upstream value added suppliers have strong political influence. Right? That effect could go away. And so when we find that higher foreign value added also tends to cause bilateral tariffs to decrease, part of the implication is, yes, global value chains matter, And additionally, it seems like upstream foreign suppliers of value added, of imported value added, aren't politically too powerful relative to the aggregate economy. Maybe this is not surprising given other work in the literature that says special interests have a relatively low political influence relative to the aggregate, but it's comforting, again, to find it here. Both of these results hold not only for bilateral preferential tariffs, these deviations from MFN and applied tariffs, but crucially, they also show up when we look at the most discretionary trade policy tools, namely anti-dumping, safeguards, CVDs. Okay. We find these anti-dumping effects across the board, but by far the most frequent territory on which we've seen anti-dumping cases levied and lodged in recent years has been against China. And so when we single out China, we find that this is especially true in anti-dumping cases against China, which is really interesting. It says global supply chains are particularly influential in determining when China gets hit with anti-dumping cases and when potentially it does not. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on the model, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. Yeah, sorry, Paul. Yeah.
Suppose you have data that allow you to move from gross output flows to value-added flows, and suppose that countries had the ability to tax imports based on that value-added. Would the formula come out different than the standard optimal tariff formula, or is there something more than just the fact that we're not targeting what we want to target? Or?
Sure. The answer is mostly nothing would be changed relative to standard models that we know. I mean, the friction here comes from the fact that we expect to see global supply chains imprinting themselves on the structure of final goods tariffs. The policy instrument that we use, which is tariffs applied to gross trade, conceptually, economists would say, no. I mean, if what you're trying to do is tax somebody else's stuff, right, the foreign residual claimants of production, the folks who get those benefits, that's what you want to do. So in principle, if we had a different trade policy instrument called tariffs on value added, they would just look like standard tariffs that we've known about and talked about since Johnson and well before, right? At 30,000 feet, no. If you drill down and then want to say, well, exactly what would that value-added tariff be applied to? Is it on the last time value-added crosses the border versus, I think you could come up with stories that would make it a little bit more complicated. But at 30,000 feet, that's conceptually exactly the right idea. We find ourselves in this fix, and we find ourselves asking this question, what do final goods tariffs look like with global supply chains? Because we don't have the perfect, from an economist's point of view, the perfect policy instrument, which is tariffs on value added. Does that make sense? If I can add a corollary, just because I think it's really neat, if you want to think about the efficiency of trade agreements, right, the Bagwell-Steger type of view, why do we need the WTO? Largely the story is, hey, all of these stories about market access, this should be value-added market access. It shouldn't be gross trade market access because, of course, what are you giving away with gross trade market access would depend hugely on what the upstream supply chain looks like. Absolutely.
So something a bit puzzled about, given, so I would have thought that you would have looked at, yes, discretionary trade policy, but input tariffs, which would be really important. If you think that all the trade, or like 2/3 of trade is intermediate goods trade, then why do we have to look at the effect of that on final good tariffs rather than intermediate good tariffs? That I'm a bit puzzled. Because you would expect a lot of effect would be on the tariffs that governments apply on intermediaries.
Yeah. Shall I? Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question. And so you're going to love our next paper because this is what it's about. I mean, this is exactly the right question. We view this paper as BBJ1 of, seriously, I think we've got we're up to BBJ5. BBJ2 is where we wanted to start, which is the simple question, what is the optimal vector of upstream and downstream tariffs? And then you can talk about things like optimal tariff escalation in a world with global supply chains. We very quickly realized that as soon as you want to talk about upstream and downstream tariffs at exactly the same time, so tariffs on intermediates and final goods simultaneously in a model, you have to take a stand, as our model will make clear, on what are price pass-throughs from final goods prices to intermediate prices. Okay, you can come up with lots of models that will tell you how to do that. You have to make assumptions about what's the nature of competition and how upstream turns into downstream production. What's the nature of substitution in the production process, not only across different source countries, but also across different sectors. Can I use upstream from sector X in output of good Y? Can I also use upstream Z? How substitutable are those? Once you start doing that, again, super interesting, you're going to love the next paper, you have to pin down much more in the model. You have to make much stronger assumptions. And that's a very different empirical exercise than this paper, which is really proof of concept. Global supply chains matter. I'll add one other piece on this because this is really important. It comes up a lot because it is a fascinating question. A point I want to make clear, whatever upstream tariffs are, whatever intermediate goods tariffs are or input tariffs are, once you observe the pattern of value added in the world, the pattern of global supply chain production in the world, that's a sufficient statistic to then go to the data and say, okay, given the pattern of value added that we observe in the world today, what should the final goods tariffs look like? Right? So we've sort of proven to ourselves, in fact, we have proven to ourselves with a rather enormous unpublished appendix that this is a sufficient statistic statement, but this is what's allowing us to separate those two questions. It's a very good one. Emmanuel? Okay, good. Great. So the model, I will not take you through the paces on all of this stuff. I'll just tell you about the model that we've written down in this paper. Again, there is a GE, much more elaborate, messier version in an appendix if you're really feeling like a masochist. So trade policy with political economy, we're going to take a homogeneous, freely traded outside good. So this is what we call Grossman-Heltman general equilibrium, right? Quotes around that. It's really partial equilibrium. We've got quasi-linear preferences. We'll assume a specific factors type structure where value added is the specific factor. We'll allow governments to be politically motivated because they are, and we need to recognize that when we go to the data. We had two twists, this very standard setup. So twist one is that final goods are produced using a combination of home and foreign value added in any given sector. And twist number two, relative to the existing literature, with very few exceptions, Chad offers one, thinks about how to characterize MFN tariffs, multilateral tariffs. We're going to characterize the optimal bilateral tariff structure, which needs to respect, again, both the MFN constraint, that's an upward bound on how high tariffs can be against any trade partner, and also the fact that trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, may be reciprocal. And if trade agreements are truly reciprocal, we would believe, potentially, through theory, we'd certainly believe, that they neutralize terms of trade externalities in final goods, and so they might shut down one of our mechanisms, namely the domestic value added, or DVA, mechanism. Okay, so this is our setup. Production, again, the key is just that output, Q, in sector S, in country C, is some function. We're going to be really hand-wavy about that. We don't have to tie our hands, so we won't. Of this homogeneous factor, L, labor, and then imported and domestic value-added components. So these are our new terms. Value-added is assumed for convenience here. It absolutely does not need to be. Again, an appendix, it's not. But we assume it's sector and destination specific with an inelastic supply. And that allows us to talk about the value-added as the residual claimant on any rents, on any revenues earned in a particular sector. Okay, and so that just makes the price pass-through relatively straightforward. When a final goods price changes, we know that that price change will be borne by all of the value-added components in a standard specific factors kind of way. National income is familiar, and here's the key to understanding this whole enchilada. National income, we're used to thinking about national income either as the sum of returns to the individual factors of production, in the first line, and tariff revenue, or equivalently as the aggregate return to final goods revenue plus tariff revenue. With value-added chains, we have to do two things. One, we have to subtract off foreign value-added. So take the value of GDP, all the final goods production in your economy, and then subtract off all of the rents from that are being paid to foreign factors of production, foreign value added, and then add back in the domestic returns that are earned by domestically produced value added that's embodied in foreign final goods production. So subtract off FVA and add back DVA. And again, the intuition here is very clear. Global supply chain linkages, value-added trade, alters fundamentally the mapping from final goods prices to outcome. And that means it's going to change tariffs. I won't dwell on the political economy structure at all. The government objective function has the standard stuff, and then we put agnostic political weights on domestic political economy, the standard stuff you're used to thinking about from Grossman and Helpman or empirical counterparts. And then we also allow political weights on foreign value added and domestic production. As mentioned before, maybe the foreign suppliers of domestically used production are lobbying the host government, or maybe we have domestic upstream producers lobbying the government to say, hey, don't put on tariffs on our value added because it's being used in this foreign final good production. So if we're making, rubber soles for sneakers, don't put tariffs on Nike's shoe exports from Thailand because some of that cost will be borne by us. Okay, so we're going to let the model tell us if that's important. Sorry, the data. The government maximizes this optimization problem. And again, the key here, I'm going to show you a first order condition just so I can show you that it's very standard with two caveats. We have our standard terms of trade motive for governments to set tariffs. That's still there, of course. But you add in domestic political economy. Again, familiar. We've talked about this for at least 20 years in the field. But you take out the effects of foreign value added and domestic value added. This leaves us with an optimal tariff function. If you go through and do the math, optimal tariff function that has a couple of components. We can interpret this by parts. This optimal tariff T is the standard inverse export supply elasticity rule. Okay, large countries set tariffs because it's good for them. Add in any domestic political economy or domestic industry may be lobbying successfully for protection, and then subtract off the effect of domestic value added and subtract off the effect of foreign value added. Just a note here, we do sort of recognize in the model the potential that there may be third country effects, and then like everybody else in the literature, most of whom just assume these away much earlier in the process, when we go to the data, we'll say our fixed effects will capture anything else going on in third countries. Okay. How late did we start?
No, I'm counting from when we started.
Oh, perfect.
We used 28 minutes, but we already rushed you a bit, so I'm taking that into account.
Thank you. Excellent. So right on time. Reciprocal trade agreements. Just a moment here. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to deal with reciprocal trade agreements in the theory. What we've ended up in the paper is, I'm just going to tell you the easy part. Reciprocity potentially neutralizes the terms of trade. And if it neutralizes the terms of trade, it has to neutralize the effect of domestic value added embodied in foreign production. Why? Well, again, if you think about the mechanism, when a government increases its tariff, it pushes down foreign final goods prices. That's a terms of trade externality. And the reason domestic value added embodied in foreign production matters is because you got upstream producers who are worried about that decrease in the foreign selling price. If you shut down the terms of trade externality, that mechanism is broken. There's no reason for the upstream domestic value-added producer who's exporting their value added that's then showing up on a return trip back to the home country, there's no reason for that upstream domestic value-added producer to worry about foreign final goods prices. Okay, so the effect of DVA goes away if we take the Bagwell-Steger theory of that trade agreements, reciprocal trade agreements, fully neutralize the terms of trade. If they only partially neutralize the effect, the terms of trade, maybe the DVA effect would get smaller. We're a little bit more formal about this in the paper. But crucially, the foreign value-added effect remains. And the reason the foreign value-added effect remains is because when the government's messing with the tariff, it's also affecting the domestic prices. The domestic prices, again, the benefit of an increase in the domestic price is partially passed on to foreign suppliers of domestically used production. Well, that price link doesn't go away with reciprocal agreements. So we would expect the influence of foreign value added, the imprint of foreign value added, to remain even when we look within reciprocal trade agreements. Okay. So this is another test that we can take to the data. We'll be initially agnostic. In fact, we'll always be agnostic about what this is. We'll let the data tell us whether or not it looks like reciprocal trade agreements are, in fact, neutralizing terms of trade externalities. As far as we know, this hasn't been tested, right? Has not been tested in the literature anywhere. So we're going to allow for it, but not impose it. Yeah.
On that point, as we know, in many of these RTAs, the bilateral tariffs are zero, at least after a while. Yeah. And what you're suggesting is that they should be kind of calibrated very carefully. But if there's a mass on zero, that would suggest otherwise. Huh?
I completely agree, and this is partially, well, the question you raised, which is, look, if you look at reciprocal trade agreements, most of them are zero. And what are the odds that zero tariffs are exactly neutralizing the terms of trade? My eyebrow raises with yours, like, I don't know, right? But we're going to recognize that in an established theory literature, to which we are also speaking, that effect is potentially there. Right? The theory tells us that those terms of trade may be fully neutralized by reciprocal trade negotiation. We're not going to take a hard stand on it, but when we go to data, we will allow for it. And you'll actually see it's sort of surprising, potentially, that we do find that there's some implicit evidence for the neutralization of the terms of trade. Maybe not perfectly, but yeah, your point is completely granted. I agree. Good. So the empirical exercise that we'll conduct, first and foremost, we need some good data. So the data is good. It was a huge undertaking to collect this data. Chad, and actually a couple of RAs over the years, put together this very clean version of data on bilateral tariffs and temporary trade barriers. Of course, been working on the temporary trade barriers for a decade plus. But the bilateral tariffs, again, we're going to exploit only deviations from MFN tariff agreements. This means that we have to measure deviations from MFN tariffs, which is not an easy task. Okay. Estimation. We'll also measure DVA and FEA. I should mention this we're working with Rob Johnson. Can I just say this? Trust me, it's incredibly careful and well done. He's the WEOD master. So we'll use IO tables and very careful methodology to come up with measures of both DVA, domestic value added embodied in foreign production, and FEA, foreign value added embodied in domestic production. The estimation itself, again, we want to predict our tariffs decreasing with DVA. We're going to start here focusing just on DVA because, as will be obvious in just a minute, of fixed effects. So I'll be clear why we're doing this in just a second when I show you the estimating equation. And we'll again ask the data, does this vary inside versus outside regional reciprocal trade agreements? We don't take a strong initial stand on FVA, foreign value added, but we allow it to be positive or negative. We do find, in fact, consistent with a weak political economy effect that it's decreasing. We have lots of econometric concerns. First and foremost, the model is very clear that foreign export supply elasticity plays a really important role in determining tariff levels, but we don't have great measures of supply elasticities. And so what we're going to use is kind of going to punt, but I would argue punting is exactly the right thing to do. We are going to say to the data, whatever that export supply elasticity is, we're going to control for it with a fixed effect. We'll correct for MFN censoring, and we'll use IV to address endogeneity.
Can I ask you a question? So if I'm not mistaken, so Rob's DVA, FEAs are very aggregate, no? Because they're from the world input-output table. So what's your, level of aggregation?
Sure, yeah. And we actually don't, it's on the slide. So Our WEO database will force us, we have disaggregated data, tariffs, but we have very aggregated input-output data. So our DVA and FEA measures have 14 industries. Okay, and you can see the list of 14 industries in the back. So things like agriculture and fishing, right? Mining. This is the level of aggregation. So it is aggregated, absolutely. By necessity. Okay, so the key equation to test is this bilateral optimal tariff. Here I've just written it out, multiplying through by the elasticity term and collecting a bunch of ugliness in this beta. All of those effects, what's the effect of the tariff changing the price? So what's the price elasticity? What's the elasticity of the price, the change in the final goods price? How much does that pass through to individual value-added producers? Right? The political economy piece, all of those enter multiplicatively in the theory. We are going to estimate the composite of those. Okay? Absent some sort of structural estimation and much more detailed data, it would be awfully hard to tease them apart. So our estimating equation will be this. What we're going to do is use a fixed effect at the multilateral level to control for export supply elasticities. And in fact, what we'll do is we'll have importer sector year fixed effects, exporter sector year fixed effects, and everything. This is a more conservative, more flexible implementation of export supply elasticities than anything else that's out there in the literature. Just to be clear, we're being more flexible, more conservative than what exists already. We're also going to include this other thing, the import decile, to recognize that the denominator of our multilateral term here is bilateral. So the numerator, how foreign value added influences domestic tariffs and how domestic political economy influences tariffs, those influences are multilateral in nature. It doesn't matter which bilateral trading partner we're talking about, but they're scaled by a bilateral import volume measure. And so what we'll do is take deciles for bilateral import volumes and interact them with a fixed effect for importer sector year. Okay, again, this is a flexible fixed effects implementation that allows us to sweep out the first two terms. Okay, this is the key. When we go to the data, what do we find? We find, lo and behold, that an increase in log, well, at this point, we're just correlations, sorry. So higher log DVA, higher domestic value added embodied in foreign final goods production is associated with lower bilateral tariffs or greater tariff preferences offered at a bilateral level, greater downward deviations from MFN. This is true if we look at the most simple implementation. If we then put in a dummy variable to sweep out all the reciprocal trade deals, the coefficient estimate goes down somewhat, but still remains very clearly negative and significant. Log DVA, we can also estimate separately. Do we see a stronger effect of DVA inside versus outside reciprocal trade agreements? And there, again, this is where theory might tell us that within reciprocal trade agreements, we might not see anything. And in fact, we don't. Okay, so there's evidence of reciprocity in bilateral tariff setting. I don't want to overemphasize this result. It's not the point of our paper, but it's interesting to see.
Emily, when you're controlling in column 2 for RTAs, does it mean that the first raw coefficient is all GSP? What is it capturing? What is the deviation from MFN that is not RTA? Is it GSP preferences?
Well, be careful. So within an RTA, we're going to recognize the fixed effect just says we recognize that within an RTA, bilateral tariffs on average are lower, right? But we still allow, here we're still exploiting the variation within a regional trade agreement across sectors, right? So we've still got that. We're assuming coefficient homogeneity here. So it's GSP and RTAs, but controlling for the fact that RTAs are just on average much lower tariffs, as you can see. And then over here, of course, then we allow for coefficient heterogeneity within versus outside of RTAs, controlling for the level effect of RTAs. Okay. So one of the things we see here is, of course, regional trade agreements don't seem to be exhibiting the DVA effect. Again, this is consistent with theory. And so here on out, we're going to focus just on the subsample of data that are trade preferences, deviations from MFN, that are not caused by regional or reciprocal trade agreements. Not by free trade deals, but this is now we're going to focus primarily on GSP, though not exclusively. We might be worried about endogeneity, as I mentioned before, reverse causality being the principal concern. We come up with a couple of instruments. One is we instrument for DVA today by looking at DVA in services. So we're looking at domestic value added in goods, instrumenting by using the pattern of domestic value added in services. We find our effects go through. The first stage looks good. You might be worried about that and say, well, there are reasons that both services and goods DVA are rising together. Could be. And so we also come up with another instrument, which is domestic value added in 1970. Pretty hard to argue that that's being caused by tariff changes in the late 1990s, okay, especially with all our fixed effects. And so when we use that other instrument, DVA in 1970, we again have a strong first stage, and we see that, if anything, the estimated effect of an increase in domestic value added, supply chain or production fragmentation, gets much stronger quantitatively. Okay. If we correct for MFN censoring, again, the results get stronger both with the IV and without the IV. The point is here, by not controlling for censoring at MFN, if anything, we understate our results. Okay. When we turn to an estimation of foreign value added, we have to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more creative. I wouldn't say more careful, more creative. Because here we're not going to be able to use any multilateral sector time specific fixed effect. But that's what we wanted to use to control for trade elasticities. But that's multilateral, and so is foreign value added, and so is domestic political economy. And so when we want to estimate the effect of foreign value added and domestic political economy on observed final goods tariffs, we're going to have to leverage these bilateral denominators. Okay, we're going to push the theory very hard here and ask the difference in the bilateral denominators to help us separately identify what is the effect of trade elasticities, which we'll pick up with a fixed effect that's now not time varying, final goods production, so this is standard domestic political economy, FVA and DVA. And when we do that, things look pretty good. I'm not going to go into detail because I'm a little low on time. But when we look at bilateral tariffs and FVA, we find that not only is DVA continuing to be negative and significant with ballpark the same coefficient estimate that we've seen before, but the FVA ratio is also negative and significant. Higher FVA means lower bilateral tariffs, greater bilateral tariff preferences. But when the domestic import competing industry is big, we see higher tariffs. That makes sense. That's consistent with a huge body of literature. Okay. We also see that these effects, if we break it up to look at OLS versus TOBIT, again, we see that censoring seems to push our estimates closer to zero. When we look within versus outside of regional trade agreements, this is sort of an interesting side note, we see that the FVA effect continues to show up empirically. If anything, it gets a little stronger within reciprocal trade deals. Theory would tell us to expect this. This is, in fact, what we see. But that DVA effect goes away. This is what we saw before, and this is what theory would predict. Okay. I won't talk about endogeneity. We do lots of things that have to get very creative because we have multiple endogenous regressors with the FVA specification. Trust me, it looks good. Looks great. Yeah, there we go. I cannot close, especially with Chad in the room, keeping me honest, without talking about temporary trade barriers. Again, the name of the game here is to ask, do observed temporary trade barriers, super discretionary implementations of trade policy also reflect the same kind of global supply chain motivations? And the answer is yes, they do. In the same way, both DVA and FVA seem to be important negative effects. Global supply chains seem to be strong influential determinants of where anti-dumping and countervailing duties are being levied and safeguards. Domestic political economy still has the positive significant effect the way we would expect given a lot of literature. And crucially, if we separate our data into China and non-China, we see that the effect of global supply chains is strongest in discretionary, heavily used temporary trade barriers levied against China. Okay, so here we see that if we interact a dummy for whether the exporter is China versus whether it is not, the coefficient estimate goes up roughly by 5 times. Okay, global supply chains are incredibly important, especially in temporary trade barriers, especially with China. I'll conclude and then I'll take it. Okay, so what we've done in the paper, again, it's a first look, it's an introductory look. There are a lot of really interesting questions to ask, like what do optimal input tariffs look like and what's optimal escalation look like. This is a proof of concept that says this is a really important question to be asking, for us to ask, and hopefully for everybody else in this room to ask more of if you already have, or just start asking more questions about. We show that tariffs affect final goods prices. That changes the prices of value added, which changes income, which changes welfare, and thus it changes trade policy. This fundamental mechanism can show up in lots and lots of different ways, different models that you could write down to formalize. The model I showed you today is one specific implementation designed to take to data so that we can have some concrete evidence that this stuff is important. We show that import protection falls with both domestic value added and foreign goods, and with foreign value added in domestic goods. And in future work, again, lots and lots to do, especially looking at the import tariff margin. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Emily. Maybe one more question because we are running a bit out of time. Emmanuel, you had a question from the beginning, so yeah.
Okay. So this is kind of a big issue kind of question. You know, the Doha round is not working for many reasons. One of the typical explanations is that there are basically no more gains to have in terms of tariff cutting because that's done already. Your point is that all this global value chain revolution start to at least increase since then. So that would suggest that there are lots of gains to be had from like the traditional multilateral round of negotiations, right?
Right.
Okay, so why is it not happening?
That's why the Doha is not going anywhere.
Yeah, but I mean, if they
Well, I will add one thing.
If the forces there are very important, they should.
Yeah, no, I think they are very important. But let's also think about what else is going with the global supply chain. With the global value chains and production fragmentation. It's not just the importance of tariffs, which can have huge effects and material effects, but it's the importance of all the other things that influence how firms actually engage in the global value chain. So things like service liberalization and regulatory red tape and safety standards and digital protections. I mean, all of these other issues that were for a long time outside the scope of the WTO, I think this same phenomenon is going to say that those are also really important, and we are seeing more emphasis on those at the WTO and in Geneva. We definitely see those other provisions, this other stuff, TPP is a trade agreement plus so much else, and that so much else, I think, is a reflection of the importance of the...
I guess we have a panel anyway on GVC. Rod, but you're speaking about that later, no, in the panel. You want to say something?
Can I just say one other thing, though,
just
to clarify? Sure. So, because you kind of skipped through this slide, this is a cross-country study. This isn't just a U.S. study. So if you're just looking at U.S. tariffs, yeah, they're low. But we've got basically the G20 in there, a number of countries, India, Brazil, Argentina. These guys still have relatively high tariffs. So.
Rod.
US value added is that the Chinese will retaliate. They'll say, look, we're going to cut you out of the supply chain. If you do this, that matters.
Yeah, but to be clear, I think that's a mechanism that's nested within our structure. There are these elasticities of how much does a change in a tariff, there are actually two elasticities that say how much does the return to my value-added supplier change when I change the tariff. If you want to build in all sorts of different things, but you could potentially build in retaliation and political effects through that mechanism, it'll be nested in our estimated coefficient. Again, I want to be clear, the way we've written down the theory is to be intentionally agnostic, to recognize that there are lots of forces that may be important here. We want to capture those and just say, does this question deserve more attention? And the answer is absolutely.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we need to move to the next paper because we want to try to get to coffee after that. So Manu. Thanks, Emily. No, let's make sure there is coffee.